Shalom and welcome to Neshama Cast, exploring Jewish spiritual care today, brought to you by Neshama, Association of Jewish Chaplains. I'm your host, Rabbi Ed Bernstein. As noted previously on Neshama Cast, professional Jewish chaplains are trained both in the wisdom of Jewish tradition and in evidence-based practices of spiritual care. Recently, Neshama, Association of Jewish Chaplains, rebooted the publication of the Journal of Jewish Spiritual Care. Today's guests on Neshama Cast are the two editors of the journal, Rabbi Charles Rabinowitz and Rabbi Bryan Kinzbrunner. Rabbi Charles Rabinowitz provides home hospice and palliative care services for Caring Hospice Services of New York. Rabbi Rabinowitz was ordained at Tifereth Israel Rabbinical Seminary. He has written extensively on narrative psychology, clinical pastoral psychology and education, and several other topics. He resides in Larchmont, New York, and I'm honored to serve with Charlie on the board of Neshama. Rabbi Bryan Kinzbrunner is the owner of New Beginnings Spiritual Coaching and Consulting LLC, helping people on the journey through the waves of life. He has rabbinical ordination from Yeshiva University and is a past president of NAJC. He makes his home in Highland Park, New Jersey. And I'll add that both of our guests are board-certified chaplains. Charlie and Bryan, welcome to Neshama Cast. It's so good to have you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast. And having listened to a few of them so far, I'm very excited to be able to participate and share today.
Well, thank you. You know, NAJC has expanded its media empire, such as it is. In the past few months, we've launched this podcast, Neshama Cast, and our organization has rebooted the Journal of Jewish Spiritual Care, which is our focus today. So it's really an honor to join you in this effort of bringing the Torah, the wisdom of NAJC, and the Torah of Jewish spiritual care to a wider audience. I'm always fascinated by the origin stories of our NAJC colleagues, so I'd like to start with a bit of your spiritual and religious origin stories. What was your spiritual life like growing up, and what was the path that led you to becoming rabbis and board-certified chaplains? Charlie, let's start with you. I'll just add that, my father is a genealogist, so it caught my eye to read that you represent the 100th generation of rabbis in your family. Can you tell us more about that and the journey that led you to be a rabbi and chaplain?
Well, our family tree starts with Hillel, and it's been a continuous generation to generation Rabbi and Dayan. They traveled from Barcelona, Spain, and then north through Holland, and then into Germany, and then eventually into Lithuania. On my mother's side is the Vilna Gaon and Moses Isserlis, and there was never any doubt what I was going to be. My father always told the story that when his father was dying, he made his son promise that when I was old enough to go to rabbinical school, that I would not go to Hebrew Union College. It scared him. That I would go to Tifereth Israel, which was founded by my ancestors. My grandfather and my father were chairs of the Talmud department and the clinical pastoral psychology departments.
Can you say a word of where Tifereth Israel is on the Jewish communal landscape in terms of its orientation?
Well, it's a transplanted Lithuanian Musar yeshiva. It is no longer in existence. Even though I was brought up in the Reform movement, it was understood that when it came time that I would go to the family yeshiva, which curriculum was a little bit different. It was 1/3 clinical pastoral psychology. It was 1/3 traditional Lithuanian Musar stuff, and an exact copy of the New York campus of Hebrew Union College coursework. It is a responsibility. And it is a calling. I mean, my grandfather and father served at Calvary Hospital in the Bronx over 40 years apiece. And about 3 months ago, one of my patients said, who had met my father, said, "So how many years has your family been doing rabbinic palliative hospice chaplaincy?" And I realized it was over 120 years.
Tell me more about your journey in chaplaincy briefly. How were you drawn to that particular line of rabbinic work?
From the time I could walk, Sunday afternoons were spent at Calvary with Dad. And, the nurses used to kid me that they knew when Dad was at the bottom of his chaplain's toolbox because suddenly you'd hear a little boy soprano voice singing to the patients. When I went to Leo Beck College in London, Dad arranged for me to spend one afternoon a week with Dame Peggy, who was the founder of the modern hospice movement at St. Christopher's in London. Basically, I've been wandering the halls of hospitals and hospices since I was about 2 years old. Like my grandfather and I were pulpit rabbis and chaplains. So I did that for about 18 years both. But it's sort of a natural part of being for me. It's something I've always done and been involved in. And, every once in a while I've come across a patient in a hospital or even in my current job that, I'll walk in the room and they sort of jump a little bit because I look like my dad. And my dad had this habit that he would take a picture of one of the children in the family and him, and the families would send it north to Manhattan. And Dad would write a prayer on the back and tell the families that whenever any of their family ended up in a hospital or were ill or in hospice at home, that to stick it in the nightstand and there would be a covering of peace, a sukkot shalom, over the patient and the family.
Beautiful imagery and wonderful stories of both yichus, the connection to elders and prior generations, and also you're forging your own particular path in palliative care. Bryan, what's your backstory?
Like Charlie, there's a little bit of a generational overlap, or continuation, I should say, but ours is a little bit different. Grew up in Florida. Long story short is I have recollections where my brothers do not, that we started off your typical non-affiliated American Jewish family. A few years later, when I was in elementary school, we started a journey back that began actually in the conservative Jewish movement for a little bit. And then eventually we being my parents, and then obviously all of us as children, became more connected through Chabad and more Orthodox over the years. So I kind of got to see a little bit of the worlds beyond like those four walls, if you will, that some people imagine in the Orthodox world. But for me personally, as any kid would go through, that's a lot of challenge and a lot of change. But already by high school, I had this inkling of, I really like this Jewish stuff, if you will. I hate to put it in such simple terms, and had always had this inkling to potentially go and become a rabbi. After some back and forth and struggle on that, and I would have to be honest, it's an interesting challenge to want to take on those responsibilities in life. I decided to forge ahead. I went to Yeshiva University, where I spent my undergraduate years and my years in rabbinic ordination and a master's degree in Jewish studies while I was there as well. And while I was doing my rabbinic studies to become a rabbi, I was trying to figure out, where do I want to land? I always had a good inclination towards helping others, which I didn't always see, but others did see in me. And yet I just didn't know if I wanted to teach, if I wanted to be a rabbi of a synagogue. And I kind of tried out the teaching thing for a little bit. Didn't really go so well in my early 20s. And in the course of a conversation one day with my father, who had risen through the ranks in one of the largest national hospice companies in the United States to become the chief medical officer. The hospice is Vitas Healthcare. So he had suggested, what about chaplaincy? It touches on a lot of your strengths and it's an opportunity. Like Charlie, though, I had experiences with hospice going back to when I was a young child, in the sense that I also remember being on the hospice wing. Didn't do the work he did, really was just there, I think, because my father was doing his rounds and we had to be there. But I remember it, and it was in the early 80s when hospice was just becoming a thing in the United States. And I even remember when I was growing up and people asked me, what did your father do? I couldn't really explain it, but hospice was always part of the language in our house. So he had suggested chaplaincy, and I did it through hospice. And that's where I started, worked in that for about 5 years, moved forward into senior care and the wide gamut of what that was for 11 years. And then my journey actually took a turn in 2021 when I decided, for a lot of personal reasons, to try to venture out on my own and try my own new beginning, which is why I named my spiritual coaching company that. It was a new beginning for me and a new beginning that I wanted to help others find as well. And so over the past couple of years, I've been building that coaching company, as well as finding myself actually back in the education world a little bit in a more, I'll call it a chaplain-y kind of role. It's guidance, counseling, but clearly the same skill base, just on a different part of the life journey, meaning I work with elementary and middle school students as opposed to people in the latter half of their life's journey. And so I've really had the opportunity to grow, religiously grow, personally grow professionally through all these years. And one way or another, it's the passion to be able to support others in their journeys, whatever those journeys may be.
I know you've certainly paid your dues, Bryan, in terms of clinical work. I'll mention that our prior guest on the Shamacast, Allison Kestenbaum, chaplain colleague of ours, she was my CPE teacher for a unit, and it was online during the height of the pandemic in 2020, and you were president of NAJC, and you came on to our graduation session in full scrubs because you had just met with a COVID patient, and I just have this image of you in full scrubs attending our CPE graduation. So I can vouch that you've paid your dues clinically.
Thank you. I mean, it was definitely a time for sure, and opened a lot of eyes in a lot of different ways.
Right, and I also have had the honor of meeting your father, Dr. Rabbi Kinzbrunner, who has lectured and spoken about bioethics and palliative care.
I guess I should add one other point, because you were talking about, I don't want to call it lineage or yichus, because it's not the same thing. Because in a certain way, I kind of paved the way. On the other hand, it was always a wish. But my uncle and my father got semicha later on, and my brother also got semicha a little later on into his career. He's a few years younger than me. My father had always wanted to be a rabbi, didn't have the chance when he was younger, but did it later. And so in a way, I forged it. On the other hand, he forged it. So it's kind of like it's two sides of the same coin, if you will. I go back and I was a stubborn teenager. Somehow I guess I picked up enough good things that I became the person I am. And I think what Charlie was saying, the same point, is when you watch your parents do whatever they're doing, whether it's in the chaplaincy world or whatever professional world, hopefully you gain those life lessons that can carry forth in whatever you do.
Yeah, so having laid the foundation with some of the life lessons you've both learned, I want to jump into our topic at hand. Bryan, there had been prior iterations of the Journal for Jewish Spiritual Care. What is the history of the publication prior to its current reboot, and what brought about its current reboot?
Actually, it's funny you should ask that question. So you're actually speaking to the two prior editors of this journal. I'll tell you my quick story about how I got into this. Charlie had been the editor. I don't remember how many years. You'll fill this in after I finish my story, Charlie. I had just started on the board in 2011, and we were at our mid-year board meeting, and I think Charlie had just taken a step back from the journal at that point. He had been the editor of a couple of previous issues, I remember, because I had submitted a couple things before that. And somebody mentioned we need a new editor of the journal. And I was new on the board, but I'm always been into writing and to working on editing and stuff. So I said, that might be something for me to take on, board portfolio, And so I volunteered. I forget how many we put out. I feel like we put out between 2 to 3 editions over the next 2 years. In 2013, I was approached to become the next NAJC conference chair at that point, which I accepted. And we really didn't find an editor, so the journal went away. It was at a time, honestly, where people who were writing seriously were trying to get published in other journals so that chaplaincy could get out there in the broader community. And I remember having a few conversations with people saying, not sure we need our own specific one. People don't have a lot of time in their day, and if they're going to write, they want to write for something that's going to get them out there. And so it really went away for a long time. And I always had this feeling of like, we didn't really, A, sunset it well, but B, why did it really have to go away? Because there's other things to be writing. Peer-reviewed journals are wonderful, research is wonderful, but we also need a place for chaplains to write about the quality parts of chaplaincy, the stories, the lessons, and in our particular case, the interface of our religion, faith, spirituality with our professional lives as chaplains. And so even when I was president, I kept kind of like saying we should probably try to bring this back. But I didn't really have a fully formulated idea on my end. And then when I became past president, I approached our president-to-be at the time, Joe Ozarowski, and I said, I think it's time to revive this. And he said, exactly. And I said, I would love to take this on. He said yes to that. Charlie agreed to join me as the co-editor. So I actually want to turn to him and see if he can fill in some more of the history instead of how we got to here today.
Yeah, please do, Charlie.
When I joined NAJC around 2001 or something like that, I was immediately asked to become part of the editorial board of the journal. It had been in existence for maybe 2, 3, 4 years before that. And I was eventually the assistant editor under Rafi Goldstein. I was editor for, I think, 3 or 4 years, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. I don't remember. But I know that I put out 3 or 4 issues a year on various topics. And it came to the point that I was asked to hand it over to Bryan to take over. But I guess I was involved from like volume 3 through volume 12. I think that's when you took over, something like that. It took us a while during COVID to get this restarted.
I think it's interesting, Charlie, the way that like we both remember pieces like clearly goes to how like memories are, but also I think it's interesting that the history of this journal, I mean, there's a lot of patchy parts to it, as you can clearly hear, like how it evolved and how it came about and how many issues there are even. It's amazing. I had some of the old ones at home. They tackle all different kinds of topics, some very challenging topics, various ethical topics that we have experienced over the years, and including this one that we'll get to, the one that we just published that we'll get to in a moment. But it says a lot about what its value was and also I think what was lost. When you stop something, when something goes away, again, there was a lot of reasons why it went away. Media has changed. I mean, the fact that we're doing a voice discussion versus just a written document is a change.
I was editor when NAJC decided to stop making paper journal and to put it totally online. So that was one of the things that I did, was take it online.
Even the question of how to put out a journal, forget the paper part, which I think is important as well, paper versus online, but you even see it now with more peer-reviewed journals, the rolling journal versus the final product, here's a volume. That was a debate we were having for a bunch of years. We should be writing, but how should it look? Until we came back around to, let's not just do something rolling, let's put out something bound, if you will.
I really think that it's a very important thing. And it certainly is. I think for both of us, it's a piece of what we are in our call, that we feel that the need to do this.
Yeah, I want to get more into that. Bryan, you had referenced earlier how many of our chaplain colleagues are publishing in journals of larger circulation to a broader audience. And we had chaplain Allison Kestenbaum on a prior episode of Neshama Cast, and she talked about her role as a researcher who has published in many of these peer-reviewed journals that you referenced. And yet, what I'm hearing is also that there is a need for Jewish chaplains to tell the story of Jewish spiritual care, which is the function that this journal serves. So I want to delve more into that. Charlie, the new issue of the journal that was just published focuses as a unifying theme on the response of Jewish chaplains to the COVID-19 pandemic. It started late 2019, that's why it's called COVID-19, but really the vast majority of us felt the effects of it starting in February or March of 2020, and there was a major lockdown, and that lasted for upwards of a year, and we're still feeling the effects of the COVID pandemic. In the journal's introduction, you describe the use of narrative psychology that the different authors included in this issue employ to share their stories. So, Charlie, what is narrative psychology, and why was it important to dedicate this issue to narrative psychology accounts of the COVID-19 pandemic?
As a people, narrative stories are an essential part of how we express our faith, how we live our lives as Jews. So the narrative part is the importance of story. The psychology part is really the essence of what we do as chaplains. We are working on life story pieces and how that affects a human being in various ways. Certainly in hospice, a major part of hospice is doing a life story piece review. And in rabbinical school at Tifereth Israel, They didn't know about clinical pastoral education. They knew about clinical pastoral psychology and the importance of story. And we were taught to engage individuals going through traumatic events by using story to get some sense of who and what they are. That's why I use purposely the words narrative psychology in it, because certainly COVID was a major changing point for all the individuals. At Caring Hospice, we thought we started to see something back in January. And so as of January 1st that year, we were wearing masks and gloves and throwing them out after every visit. We knew something was coming. And when it came, we all saw the effect of overwhelmed hospitals, of suddenly doing telehealth. For a good part of 3 years, I sat at my dining room table in my overhot apartment in a t-shirt and pair of shorts, but still finding a way to make those connections one-on-one with my patients and their families. And both Bryan and I knew it changed a lot of how we do chaplaincy. And quite frankly, I'm still having patients die of COVID. And we saw, and then as I was doing my training of the chaplains that I work with and doing the spiritual care that I do with all the staff members at Caring, there was a lot of change, and there was a lot of things we had to learn how to do and to make that sacred connection between ourselves and our patients, and helping our nurses get through this horror. And I think it's changed Jewish chaplaincy forever.
Just to give one more shout out to our colleague chaplain Allison Kestenbaum, when she was talking on Neshama Cast about the role of a researcher, she talked about quantitative research and qualitative research. So it seems to me that narrative psychology and the format that the journal took, at least in this issue, is focusing on qualitative research.
Yeah, it's definitely qualitative research. I would add that our journal in the past had research articles from various members of our NAJC. I know that I purposely published the research that I did over the years in the journal, not going to a bigger name journal, because I thought that it was important for us to have it for ourselves.
I want to make a point, and then Bryan, I want you to jump in. Narrative psychology, I don't think should be dismissed as something that's different or less than research. It is a form of qualitative research that we as chaplains are using to improve our field. Is that right?
Right. And it's something that we've always used as one of our tools. It is in some ways peer-reviewed qualitative research is what it really ends up being.
Bryan, please jump in.
Actually, I want to just make a little bit of a tweak on the words qualitative research, because in the current, more academically oriented journals, when they talk about qualitative research, there's still a quantitative aspect to it. It is based on narratives and anecdotals that then, if you look at a lot of the articles, there's still the statistical analyses and so on. What we're doing here, and in a way we'll continue to do here, is let's get the human element back into it too. I remember at one of our conferences I went to, actually it was Raphael Goldstein's session that he did many years ago, our former executive director, our former member, unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, who talked about this topic of writing for these peer-reviewed journals. And I remember he was describing that tension of research, but research is very, for lack of a better word, it's bland. So it's important, but it's not a story. It's information, and it's important information. And yet there's something that's sort of lacking. Now, these other journals, some of them will include reflective pieces and some won't, but they're always tucked away in the bottom. Here, Journal of Jewish Spiritual Care in general, this issue particularly, is here's the human stories during COVID-19, whether in an article form or we had a poem in there, in some sort of reflective manner, something tied into that time period. That comes to fill in the other gap. And I think that the qualitative piece that I refer to is the quality of what we do is not just in the bigger sense, but it's in the individualized moment-to-moment encounters that we have. And wherever world and modality of work we do, that's the quality, the other that has to be brought into the puzzle as well. Then, as I said before, then add in the Jewish piece. And I don't mean that it's secondarily, but add in our own voices and our own language and our own textual encounters that have to then be brought back into it. That makes the uniqueness. I would also add, I did mention people do want to write for journals, but not enough people are writing. And so here's an avenue that I can write the reflective essay versus I have to write it just the detailed research essay, which we want as well. We want all of that. And they're all equal. I'm saying that also as a long-term goal. I won't say that this first one filled all those gaps, but that is the long-term goal of this bringing it back is let's take on all these different elements and pieces and put them together. Maybe it's ambitious, but that's my goal.
Charlie, you write in this issue of the journal in your piece that in 1-2 month period during the height of the COVID pandemic, your patient population declined from 160 to 100. Even in a hospice program, that is a massive loss. I'd like to explore a little more deeply with you what was the personal toll that took on you in your chaplaincy and as a person, and how did you manage in your chaplain work?
One of the things that I did and still am doing is that I started putting like a prayer poem at the beginning of the workday for all the staff because I wanted them to have some kind of focus as they went out there. At one point we had 70% of our staff were infected. To me, it was difficult because I not only was trying to do my own self stuff inside my head, but I was taking care of not only my patients and their families, but I was taking care of all the staff from the director down because it was just so traumatic. My caseload fluctuates anyway, but at one point I had, close to 60 patients, and within a month I had 30 or less. And it was listening to nurses who were crying on the phone with me, trying to find something within themselves so that they could go into those homes again, and trying to teach the other chaplains, how do we handle that double load? I think partially because I grew up in this stuff. I had enough that Dad had taught me because, working at Calvary was not easy for those two generations. All your patients die. And I think also part of it, for me personally, is the Musar piece. There's a lot of psychology in Musar. There's a lot of pre-preparation before you pray. There's pre-preparation before you walk into a room to do whatever you're going to do. And there's a lot of after the fact, what you have to do inside yourself to be able to handle all that stuff. And I guess that's about the best answer I can give you.
Bryan, our colleague, Rabbi Ben Weinberg, who's also an NAJC board member, contributed an essay to the journal titled Making Space, a reflection on coronavirus. Rabbi Weinberg talks about the role of a chaplain in making space for the people we serve in chaplaincy to address the matters that are on their mind. Bryan, what does the metaphor of making space mean to you, and what was the role of making space for patients, for fellow staff members, for really anyone during the COVID-19 lockdown as you experienced it?
Making space. That's a funny metaphor when you're dealing with lockdown, right? The very nature of lockdown is making space. And questions about how we made space, and I'll even be so bold as to say, did we make too much space literally, and how that all played out, I think we're going to be thinking about for a long time. But making space in this context is twofold. When we're doing hospice work, senior care work, working with people in the later years of their lives, we're entering their space, and we're entering it as strangers in the sense that, yes, one day we'll be on the other side of that. Hopefully we should all live long enough to be on the other side of that in a way, but we're a stranger to it. So in a general world, we walk in, they're the person we're caring for. We're there as that listening ear, that caring person, that spiritual provider, etc. Then you bring it into something that everybody's dealing with, and all of a sudden you're both in the same boat. With hospice, like Charlie, it was a lot of telehealth, if you will, a lot of phone calls to families, a lot of trying to figure out how to navigate, the person's dying, can they be there, not be there, etc. In the assisted living world, it was a little bit more interesting because I was able to be with people, but again, as Ed, you pointed out earlier, I was dressed up in full garb, or I think, it looked like a space spacesuit at some point, to be honest. Anyways, I do make that joke sometimes. It did look a little bit like a spacesuit, but you could be present to people in a sense. You could still be in certain radius, certain distance. But you were walking in not as a stranger, but you were walking in as another person in that same story, regardless of what was going on in the room, because everybody knows that there's that elephant in the room, which is COVID thing. You could be bringing it in without knowing it. They could have it and you could get, all those different things going through your mind. And I remember our president before me, Sandra Katz, I had a conversation with her and we were talking about this and, what does it look like? And I said, the truth is at the beginning, especially, I can't imagine anybody who didn't have some anxiety about walking into that space. And I remember having this conversation with her and saying, I'm feeling anxious about it. She goes, that's fine. When you walk in that space, I'm paraphrasing, so this is not a direct quote, but it's okay to bring that anxiety with you because they have that anxiety and you have that anxiety. Acknowledge it. And the way she put it was be a non-anxious presence, not be an unanxious presence, but a non-anxious presence, meaning once we acknowledge that feeling, well, then we can make the space that we need to make from the beginning. So the making space during COVID was really a twofold process in my eyes. Was that perfect? Not at all. Has that created a lot of other depth issues that we're still trying to dig out? Yes, we are, even all these years later. But that would be what making space is to me in a nutshell, especially in that moment.
I think that the making space also stems from the fact that I always think about the sacred space around the bed, and what that means. It's sort of like Moses, taking off his sandals at the burning bush, but it's the making space part is also a religious conscious action. And the making space was how we expanded that because we had to. So that the making space was expanding that sacred space around the bed through the telephone lines, and whatever, or wearing the PPE and how that affected when you walked into that holy space. But I think that's part of it as well.
Charlie, in addition to the journal containing narrative prose, this issue of the journal also includes poetry, particularly a beautiful poem, Being the Spiritual Link, by our colleague Rabbi Andrea Gause. Let's listen to Andrea read her poem in her own voice.
Being the spiritual link. Eyes, searching, pleading, weary, the light of hope dimming. Hands, moving with purpose, fluttering aimlessly, reaching out, trying to hold on. Breath, short gasps, fractured, hurried, getting too caught up to breathe. Patient, caregiver, each caught in the same cycle, each mirroring the other, each synchronous with the other. When looking at the eyes, hands, breath, which is which? Chaplain, standing in the intersection, pulled by both the patient and caregiver, struggling, straining, being the bridge over the abyss, the bridge that connects them on a deeper level than their physical, holding them up, creating holy, sacred space, providing hope, the ability to hold on, and reaching across to create the spiritual link.
Chaplain as a bridge is a powerful metaphor. It reminds me of the Hebrew term for chaplaincy, livui ruchani, spiritual accompaniment, in which we as chaplains escort someone from one side of a threshold to another. What is the role of poetry in a journal on Jewish spiritual care, and what, if any, additional thoughts do you have on Andrea's poem?
Like everything else that we do, part of every visit that I make includes some form of poetry and prayer and some form of me singing. There's a reason why every important story in Torah has a prose version and a poetry version. The expansion of how we deal with everything that we deal, it needs different elements in writing. It's the narrative, it's the poetry. If we could figure out a way to put the song in there too, we probably would too. But I know, after speaking to her, that she felt that the best way that she could reflect on how we were dealing with Jewish chaplaincy during COVID was to put it into the form of a poem, and she did it very well. On other types of articles, reflections and poetry that we included in this issue, I was a very light editor on what our colleagues gave to us.
I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit. The truth is, we're not the only journal that has ever published poetry in a research-oriented journal. Look at the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling, which is one of the fundamental pastoral care journals that most of us have access to and are looking through. Again, a lot of research. There's reflection pieces. There's poetry. There's book reviews. One of my hopes to bring back at some point too. We did that for a while in our former iteration, but because again, how do we get that message across? You just listen to Andrea's words. What did we talk about just now? Making space, and the chaplain sort of sitting in that abyss. That's a space. That's our role, bridging the gaps, right? That's in that same genre, but in a different way. I've dabbled in poetry at points earlier in my life. I may not be the most poetic of people in that sense. There are many who find poetry to be the true form of expressing what's deep inside of them. Others find prose to be that, even though usually when you get to that point, it is poetic, most of that prose. But I think that that's important for us going forward, is be that place for that poetic reflection too, because that's just as important.
And that's why I use that morning poetry prayer to the staff every morning for the last 3+ years. That's the best way to convey and to set a person in that space and on that bridge that we walk constantly.
Yeah. How often do you plan to publish the journal, and what do you have lined up for future issues, or any specific themes that you plan to cover? Bryan, you want to take that first?
Presuming this is coming out very shortly, because we'll put out a call for papers. Our next issue working title, again, we'll probably tweak it by the end, will be Jewish Chaplaincy Changing During War and Rising Anti-Semitism. Really a place for us to do the reflection of how our lives have been since October 7th. As chaplains, as people who work in multi-faith institutions, as people who are balancing the personal and professional struggles. But I will also say, and then I'll get to the deadline piece of this, is that issues having themes are very important, and a place to place your writing is very important. So for those who are listening, if you have something that you're interested in writing, but it's not directly along the lines of the theme, we have place for that too. Don't be stuck in a theme, because what would happen in the past is we'd come up with a theme and then we would either have to shoehorn things in or we wouldn't get enough. No, let's write. Even if it's one page, right? If somebody wants to write 1-page reflection on a case study that they had or something, this is the place for it. Or I mentioned a book review. You read a book that you think is important to your chaplaincy work. Maybe it's outside the box a little. Write something on that. Whatever it is. And I don't mean that in a willy-nilly kind of way. I mean that in a serious way. Let this be the place to put your writing, in addition to the things that we want to focus on. And this is our focus now, is how are we as chaplains during this time of rising anti-Semitism? My goal, and Charlie, we were still kind of hashing this out by email today. That's why I'm saying my goal is to collect this over the next couple months and get it out, hopefully, I would say by mid-year, so that we can then do a second one that'll get out towards the end of the year. We'll have to come up with a topic for that, but that's really the goal. That's really the ideal. I don't think, people could try to do 4 a year. I think there's a place for that too. But right now, let's let our ambition be 1 at a time, but hopefully 2 this year. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Charlie, but that's sort of my pitch to everybody who's listening today.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, I think that given how long it took us to get this one out, I think it's a realistic goal to say 2 issues for 24. And certainly, as in the past, just like Bryan said, we want, if you have something you really want to say, if you have a book that you want to review for us, you have a poem that you want to write for us, we will fit it in. A theme does not mean that the entire journal issue has to be only on that. We will put in whatever we can get. In my entire rabbinate, I have always encouraged rabbis and chaplains to put stuff down on paper, because you have something important to say. You've experienced something that maybe somebody hasn't seen in the same way you went through it. My ancestors certainly wrote lots of different types of books and tractates and what have you. Grandpa and dad, certainly they wrote serious research stuff. and they wrote stuff on Torah and Talmud and what have you, but it all came out because it was something important to get out there, and that's what we really want to encourage. Part of the reason that the issue took so long to get out is that we weren't successful in encouraging our colleagues and friends of NHAC to put something down on paper. It's not length. It's, if it's a reflection and it's just, 1, 2, 3 pages, that's fine. And if it's something that you are dying to comment on, put it down on paper and give it to us.
So to our colleagues who are listening, send our editors your written pieces. Bryan and Charlie, as we arc towards a conclusion, it's interesting that you've referenced, or we've talked about the first issue of the rebooted journal focusing on COVID-19 and anticipation that the next issue will focus on our work as chaplains in the aftermath of October 7th. It seems like we and the people we serve are careening from one crisis to another. As a closing thought, can you briefly address what keeps you grounded and able to keep going in the midst of going from one crisis to another?
I think, first of all, it's my family. I'm a very, very lucky man. My wife is an incredible woman, and my children are very special to me. When I get home, they know me well enough that they know what, to give me the space and the time and to support me in the way that I do. Wendy often says that she doesn't worry about me if she hears me singing. And I have a number of things that I do for my own self to make sure that I can get through all these kind of crises. I'm the oldest member of the Larchmont Temple softball team. Okay, coaching first base because I can't quite do anything more at this point. But I'm a member with my daughter of the Walkabout Clearwater Chorus, which Pete Seeger founded many decades ago to bring the message of the Clearwater onto land. So there are things that I do and the things that I am supported by. I'm also lucky that I'm a member of a synagogue that allowed us to stay after my time was up. And we've been very active members at Larchmont Temple. And we've been very well supported for all the work that we do for Temple, and we're supported very much by a very special rabbi or two. That's how I keep on going.
Thank you. Bryan.
I think there are a couple of things I would say is one is, I think Charlie hit it on the head, is having strong foundational pieces to life, whether it's family, whether it's community, whether it's fulfillment. I think those things help us through it. I think it's important to recognize the things that we can do and the things that we can't do. I'm not one of those, I said this on a different podcast, but I am one of those that doom scrolls. It is true. So I'm not one of those who's going to say don't doom scroll. But I think at the same time, it's important to recognize the limits for ourselves. If that becomes too much, well, stop. And I don't mean that in a, again, sort of like a quick fix kind of answer, but how do we deal with crisis is we have to know who we are and our limits and what we can and cannot handle, and be forgiving when we push ourselves a little bit further. These are lessons I learned from myself. I learned them the last few years, a lot of those things. Still learning them. I think we're always learning them. And I think in this particular case, this current crisis moment is just reminding us of that sometimes we have to look internally too, and we can't just look externally. And sometimes you have to look externally and internally at the same time. And that's a very broad conversation. That's why I say community is so important. Charlie, you said it as well. When you think about the synagogue you're part of and the Jewish community you're part of, again, your community, my communities, and anybody's community, is that giving us a place and a space? And I think that's been very important for me as well. And in my case, I'm around kids all day now, or half the day, I guess. It's very inspiring and very powerful in new ways that I didn't even realize. And that just shows life. There's still life. There's still life. We're still doing, we're living, we're laughing, we're smiling. And yet, we're also hoping and praying that these things end. However we want them to end, we're hoping and praying that they end, and that they end in the least harmful way possible is the best way I would put it, because there's always harm. Doesn't matter how, but least harmful way.
Rabbi Bryan Kinzbrunner and Rabbi Charlie Rabinowitz are the co-editors of the newly rebooted Journal of Jewish Spiritual Care, published by Neshama, Association of Jewish Chaplains. Bryan and Charlie, thank you so much for coming on Neshama Cast. May you be blessed to continue to touch the souls and warm the hearts of everyone you encounter.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for the opportunity to do this.
Neshama Cast is a production of Neshama, Association of Jewish Chaplains. Thank you to Rabbi Charlie Rabinowitz and Rabbi Bryan Kinzbrunner for being our guests. Thank you to Rabbi Andrea Gauss for reading her poem, Being the Spiritual Link. Check out our show notes for a link to the current issue of Journal of Jewish Spiritual Care. Special thanks for technical and logistical support to Rabbi Katya Philo, Allison Atterbury, NAJC Acting Executive Director, and Rabbi Drew Kaplan and the NAJC Social Media Committee. Transcripts for this episode and other episodes of Neshama Cast are available at neshamacast.simplecast.com. Our theme music is a nigun for Ki'anu Amecha, written and performed by Reb Cantor Lisa Levine. Please help others find the show by rating and reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts. We welcome comments and suggestions for future programming at neshamacast@gmail.com. And be sure to follow NAJC on Facebook to learn more about Jewish spiritual care happening in our communities. May we all work together to heal our world.
I think Bryan was a little bit more polished than this old chaplain here, but that's okay.
Well, in my case, I'm like watching the battery on my computer dying soon, and I have to plug it in, and I got to hop on another Zoom in a couple minutes. So I'm like, whatever.